This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program, Living Legends Collection. This interview was originally conducted on the 18th of November, 1969. The interview is conducted by Mr. K. Franz, F-R-A-N-Z. The interviewee is Mr. William T Gossett of the Ford Motor Company. This interview is being conducted in the office of Mr. Fred Jones in Oklahoma City. This interview is being re-recorded on August the 29th, 1985 for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Mitchner.
This is K. Franz with the Living Legends Program, sponsored by the Oklahoma Historical Society. The date is 18 November 1969. The setting for this interview is at 900 West Main in Oklahoma City in the office of Mr. Fred Jones. Today we have the honor of interviewing Mr. William T Gossett. Mr. Gossett, a native Oklahoman, a recent honoree to the Oklahoma Hall of Fame, is currently serving as general counsel for the Ford Motor Company in Detroit, Michigan. Mr. Gossett, I understand that you were born in Texas and shortly thereafter moved across the Red River with your parents and settled in Oklahoma. Could you give us a little idea of what your early life, what your ancestors were like?
Yes, thank you very much. I came to Oklahoma in 1911 with my parents, 4 years after the Oklahoma Territory became a state. We spent the summer in Ardmore, Oklahoma. Then we moved on to Chickasha. I began school there and finished school there. Got all of my elementary and secondary schooling in Chickasha. My parents then moved to Salt Lake City, Utah. I finished college there, received an A.B. at the University of Utah, 1925, and went on to Columbia Law School in that year and received a law degree there in 1928. I now, incidentally, am a life trustee of Columbia University. Following law school, I became associated with the Hughes firm in New York, headed by Charles Evans Hughes at that time, who had just been Secretary of State and who later became Chief Justice of the United States. 2 years later, I married his daughter, married the boss's daughter. I stayed in New York for 18 years, practiced law in that firm, was counsel for several corporations, Fox Film, Aluminum Company of America, Bendix Aviation, Ford Motor Company, several other, DuPont, and did some work for the Rockefellers, the Standard Oil Company. In 1947, I became Vice President and General Counsel, member of the Board of Directors of the Ford Motor Company. Having spent the preceding 3 or 4 years as General Counsel of Bendix Aviation Corporation. I remained with the Ford Motor Company in that capacity until 1962, when I retired early, and that year, that fall, I became a member of the White House staff under President Kennedy. I was deputy to Christian Herter in connection with a trade program, the purpose of which was to negotiate new tariff schedules with other countries, the common market and other countries. I had the rank of ambassador, and we began the negotiations that were culminated in 1967 with the so-called Kennedy Round. I was thereafter president of the American Bar Foundation, which is the research arm of the American Bar Association. I was president of National Legal Aid and Defender Association, chairman of the board of the United Negro College Fund, and in 1967 I was nominated, designated president-elect of the American Bar Association, and I just finished that term of office as president of the American Bar Association last August, and I've just been 2 weeks, for the past 2 weeks, in South America representing the association at the annual meeting or biannual meeting of the Inter-American Bar Association. I'm here in connection with the honor that I received yesterday as an inductee designee for the Hall of Fame, a great honor, one that I appreciated very much, especially in view of my Oklahoma background.
Thank you, sir. You mentioned a great number of famous people with whom you've been associated. Christian Herter, President Kennedy. You've held the presidency of several multi-million-dollar organizations. Can you tell me, Mr. Gossett, some of the Oklahomans that you have been associated with during your life that have played a significant role in our history or in national history?
Well, since I moved away from, in view of the fact that I moved away from Oklahoma at the end of, virtually at the end of high school, I can't claim to have been associated with many famous Oklahomans. I did know Will Rogers because I was counsel, my firm was counsel for Fox Film Corporation when he was acting. So I saw him on the set often when I was in Hollywood. Also, I used to draw his contracts, and I knew him very well. One day when I prepared and presented to him a draft of a contract, he said to me, this contract is much too long. He said, why do I need all this language? Why do I need all this rhetoric? He said, why can't I just have a short contract? He says, let me tell you what kind of a contract I want. He took out one of those, he removed from his pocket one of those telegraph blanks that he used in sending messages daily to the New York Times. You'll recall he had a box on the first page of the second section of the New York Times every day. He took out one of those and he wrote out, I, Will Rogers, agree to work for Fox Film Corporation for so much a week and do the best I can, and Fox Film Corporation agrees to pay me so much a week and so much in cash and to put it in deposit in a bank, the balance. He said that now that's all I need. And he really was quite accurate in his summary of the situation, in his appraisal of the situation, because as I learned later when I became a more experienced lawyer, the general legal provisions cover most of the provisions that we put in contracts, and so all you need is a very brief contract, and he had analyzed the situation quite accurately as I look at it now in proper perspective. He was a fine man. He never went to college, and he seemed to murder the King's English, but actually he didn't. His grammar was pretty good. He had a slang that he used for commercial purposes, but I learned from him that he was graduated first in the class at Kemper Military School. So he was a very bright man. He pretended to be an ignorant cowboy, but actually he was really quite bright, and he accumulated a lot of property. He received high compensation at Fox Film Corporation. He owned much land in Southern California, and it became more and more valuable, and so his estate was quite large when he died. I also have had the privilege and pleasure as an officer of the Ford Motor Company in knowing and coming to appreciate a great Oklahoman, Fred Jones, who was a Ford dealer and an oil man in Oklahoma. He runs 6 or 7 Ford and Lincoln Mercury dealerships in this state. He also reconditions more Ford Motor Company Ford-built engines than any man in the United States. He collects them or they're shipped to him from 13 states into Oklahoma. He has 500 people working on those engines, and he reconditions them and returns them to the dealers from which they came. And when he finishes a reconditioning job, the engine is just about as good as it ever was, perhaps a little better. He's been very successful not only as a Ford dealer, but also as an oil man. His oil income, I'm sure, is equivalent to his income from the Ford Motor Company or from the sale of Ford products. He's been very successful. He's a man of good judgment and business acumen. He was at one time chairman of the board of Braniff Airlines. His business judgment is excellent, and he is an alert, diligent, and very successful businessman, and a man of good character. At the Ford Motor Company, they say that when Fred Jones tells you he'll do something, his word is, to use an old expression, his word is his bond, and you can count on it. And that is just as important, I think, just as important an attribute for a man as brains. I think brains are terribly important. You can't do well in life unless you have brains, but neither can you do well unless you have character. And Mr. Jones, although I think he's not an educated man, I don't think he is a college graduate. He came to Oklahoma as a boy and started to work for the Ford Motor Company in the assembly plant here in 1916. And then he became a Ford dealer. He's been here, you see, for more than 50 years. He celebrated his 50th anniversary as a Ford dealer some 2 or 3 years ago. And he is, while not an educated man, is a man of great wisdom and sophistication as a businessman, and is a great credit to the state.
Mr. Gossett, you mentioned that earlier in the interview that you married the boss's daughter. Of course, the boss was quite a famous individual. Could you tell us a little bit about him and also your family?
My father and mother came to Oklahoma, as I said, in 1911. My father acquired a number of small hotels, one in Chickasha, one in Anadarko, one in Lawton. He operated those hotels over the years until he sold out and went out to Salt Lake City to retire in 1921, 22. Neither my father nor my mother had much education, but they always preached the value of education to us, to children, and we all went to college, and we all accepted their good advice. We went to college to learn. We didn't go there, as some of the present students do, to tell the college how to run the place. We picked up as much information as we could. They moved on from Salt Lake City to California, where they lived many years before they died. But I think many of their happiest years were spent right here in Oklahoma. And I value so much my life in Oklahoma because many of the standards of life that I acquired as a youngster, most of them came from the people whom I knew here. All the values that I have profited by in my professional life and in my business life were acquired right here in Oklahoma. And while I had a good record, scholastic record here, I never expected to do as well at Columbia University because I was competing there. I never expected to do as well as I did do there because I was competing there with Phi Beta Kappas from Yale and Harvard and Princeton and Amherst and so on. With my class in law school, they were in my class at law school, 60% of the students were Phi Beta Kappas. And the dean of the law school said that although I had a good scholastic record at college, he thought that I might have some trouble competing at Columbia. with with the high caliber class with which I was associated. Actually, a lot of those Phi Beta Kappas didn't do so well. Some of them flunked out, and I came out very well indeed. So I thought that it was quite a tribute to the education I had received in Oklahoma and at the University of Utah. When I went in the Hughes firm in New York, the offices were down on Wall Street. Mr. Hughes, Charles Evans Hughes, was the head of the firm. He had just finished a term as Secretary of State, and he was practicing law in New York City and handling a very heavy, large volume of business. He had more business than he could handle, and I was one of 6 young fellows taken into the firm in 1928 to help him and other partners in handling that business. I went through the Hoover-Smith campaign with him in 1928, and I did research for him on some of the speeches that he did in support of the Hoover campaign for the presidency. As you recall, Hoover was elected he won the election from Hal Smith in 1928. I would bring in a memorandum of research that I had done at his request on, say, a Monday morning. He would read it very hastily. He read with great speed. He would ask me a few questions. Then he would make a sketchy outline on a piece of yellow paper that he was going to, of a speech he was going to do that night. He would then call in stenographers, and one would be typing while the other was taking dictation. In about an hour and a half, he would have dictated a 5,000-word speech. He would revise it just once. That afternoon, he would read it over aloud 2 or 3 times, and that night he'd deliver it from memory, word for word. He had a photographic mind. I would sit behind him on the platform with the script, and occasionally he would interpolate. That is, he would leave the script and add something that occurred to him as he spoke. And he would seem to put a mental finger at where he left the script and come right back, pick it up, and then go on with the rest of the speech. I thought to myself, if you have to be this good to be a successful lawyer, I'm never going to make it, because that was a gift that I didn't receive. The speeches I made later and wrote later, the jobs I held, including the presidency of the American Bar Association. Incidentally, he was president, and he took over as president of the association in 1944 in Philadelphia, and I succeeded him 44 years later, 1968, and I took over in Philadelphia, which is quite a coincidence. But he was an amazing man. He handled a large volume of business. He was a man of great intellectual capacity, but he also had character and intelligence and balance, good judgment, and with those combination of qualities, he had to be a great man. And his daughter, his youngest daughter, is the one I married. She was born in Albany when he was governor. She was the first child ever born in the governor's mansion in Albany. She inherited his fast mind. She reads a book in an evening. She reads right down the middle of the page, and she also inherited his ability to memorize quickly, and so she writes out, when she was going to make a talk, she writes out her thoughts on 7 or 8 pages of yellow paper and reads it over a couple of times. She gets up and spills it right off. She's the only one of 4 children who inherited that capacity, that great attribute of photographic memory. She could just see the words on the page as he could. Mr. Justice Brandeis told me once that Judge Hughes had an advantage over the other justices because he read so fast. He could read 3 or 4 lines while the other judges were reading 1 line. That's a great advantage. He was always an inspiration. I worked for him about 2.5 years before he became Chief Justice. He was never a disappointment in any respect. He was a very, very great man. And the training I received as his assistant, one of his assistants in those years, served me well, has served me well over the years.
Mr. Gossett, you mentioned that you served in some capacity for President Kennedy. Could you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yes, I was on the White House staff as a special assistant to President Kennedy for a year and a half, and my immediate superior was Christian Herter. We both held the rank of ambassador, and our job was to advise the president on tariff and related trade matters. We were special assistants for trade negotiations. President Kennedy was a very impressive young man. I was much older than he, but I was always impressed with him. I sat in many meetings in the cabinet room with him on economic matters, and also we sat in on the security council matters and on the balance of payments problems and so on. So I used to see him at least once a week, and usually 2 or 3 times a week, usually late in the afternoon. He had a very quick mind. He had an inquiring mind, he had great intellectual curiosity. He had an ability to cut through the irrelevant things and come right to the point get down to the major point at issue and the real relevancies of the problem. Also, he read with great speed. If you took a document to him, he would read it very quickly and ask you questions about it, and he always asked the appropriate questions, it seemed to me. And in these cabinet meetings, he was a good listener. He would let everybody who had an idea put it on the table, and then he would ask a few questions and make a decision. And the decisions were surprisingly sound, it seemed to me. He had great powers of concentration. He kept his mind right on the point. His mind didn't wander to other things, and he seemed to have a way of putting everybody into the discussion, getting everybody's ideas on the table before he made a decision. And then his decision, I thought, was almost always sound as far as I could determine. And I think that was his record while he was down there. It was a great tragedy, his death. I was in London at the time, and I was in a restaurant with my wife, and we were recognized as Americans, and the head waiter told us about the president's assassination, and we went out into the street, and there was great sadness there. I've never seen London or any foreign city so obviously saddened by the death of a foreigner. He was very popular in England, and we were scheduled to attend a theater that evening, and there was a pall over the whole proceedings. Nobody was interested really in what was going on the stage. They were all thinking about President Kennedy. I regarded him as a great asset to the United States abroad. I think that had he been president, there is considerable doubt that we would now be in the position in Vietnam that we find ourselves. I think he would have been able to negotiate us out of that war, or would have been more resourceful in finding means to avoid putting American troops in there. I know that President Johnson had advice that turned out to be bad advice, and I'm sure that he used his best judgment, but I had a feeling that if President Kennedy had survived, we probably wouldn't be involved in that situation now. As far as Christian Herter is concerned, he was an able man, a graduate of Harvard with honors, as President Kennedy was. He had been Secretary of State. He spoke French. He was born in Paris, and he spoke French. It was his first language he ever knew, so he spoke it very fluently. He was highly respected abroad. He was a good negotiator. He was a good administrator. Unfortunately, when I was with him, he had developed some bad health, and so he was not as active as he could have been or should have been had he been in the job, had the job 10 years earlier. But I learned a great deal from him about foreign relations and about diplomacy. His his years in the service in the State Department were, of course, very valuable to him, and made him a very sophisticated person in diplomacy. He not only had been in there while he was Secretary of State, but he'd been in there earlier in life, first as a special assistant to Hoover when he was in the Commerce Department, but he dealt with foreign affairs, economic matters, and then he moved over into the State Department and was there under several Secretaries of State. So he was a very experienced man in the State Department, and we were, I think, successful in the negotiations largely because of the respect in which he was held and the hard work we did and the good advice we received in connection with those negotiations and ended in 1967.
Mr. Gossett, during the Kennedy administration and while you were working with Christian Herter, did you have an opportunity to work with any of the House or Senate members, particularly those from Oklahoma?
Yes, not only when I was with on the Kennedy staff, but earlier when I was Vice President of the Ford Motor Company, I testified before many congressional committees on behalf of the Ford Motor Company, and I testified, for example, on a number of occasions before committees or subcommittees on which sat or which were headed by Mike Monroney, Senator Monroney, who was defeated in the last election. Senator Monroney was a very able man, and I think represented the state of Oklahoma well in the Senate. He was industrious, well-informed, highly articulate, and hard driver. He was tenacious in his views and in wanting to get things done. He was courageous, I thought, in many respects, and I think was highly respected, not only in the Senate but among businessmen, as a man who had integrity and who had the broad public interest in view in all of his activities. He at one time, I think, got off on the wrong track when he tried to when he suggested that the automobile manufacturer's the relations between the automobile manufacturer and the dealer be put under the jurisdiction of the Federal Trade Commission. In other words, all the contracts for sale of automobiles between the manufacturer and the dealer, he thought, should be under the jurisdiction of the Federal Trade Commission. We in the automobile industry thought that was wrong, that was short-sighted and would be ill-advised, because we pointed out if we got the government into that relationship, they also would want to get into the relationship between the dealer and the public, and first thing anybody knew, all the automobile business would be under the Federal Trade Commission in a big way, just as the railroads are under the Interstate Commerce Commission and so on. In other words, the automobile business was become a sort of a public utility, and so to speak, in some respects. Well, I testified before him, that is Senator Monroney, with respect to that matter, and I think persuaded him that that was an erroneous viewpoint, and we persuaded the dealers that it was, and they talked him out of it. But obviously he was thinking of the public interest and the interest of the dealers when he conceived of the idea, but I think he recognized later that it was unsound. I think, though, that he was a great credit to the state and served the state well in the Senate. I don't know much about his successor, but I know that Senator Monroney was well regarded, as I said, not only in the Senate but in the business community. Albert is well regarded also, highly respected senator, or member of the House, I guess. It's Congressman Albert. He is a minority leader, or whip, isn't he? And he's a man of great intellectual capacity. He speaks incisively. He knows how to talk. His judgment is good. He is a good representative for the state. He votes, I think, independently, not only with due regard for the interests of the state, but with due regard for the interests of the people of the United States generally. He's respected not only by his colleagues in the House, but also in the other body and by the administration. I don't know him well, but I have a high regard for him, and I think he's respected generally in Washington, by the Washington community. I had dealt with Senator Kerr when I was on the White House staff. He was a dynamic leader in the Senate. He was courageous and bold, and had great influence there. He was respected as a hard fighter, and I think had great influence there. He was respected as a hard fighter, and I think represented strongly the interest of Oklahoma in the Senate, especially the oil interests. Also, he was interested in the trade program, and he was the leader in getting through the legislation that authorized the negotiation of new tariff schedules. That legislation was enacted late in the summer of 1962, was signed by the President, I think, in October. And as a result of that legislation, Christian Herter was appointed Special Representative for Trade Negotiation, and I was appointed his deputy. And we administered that act, which Senator Kerr got through. Senator Kerr was the leader in the Senate of that legislation. It was written under his direction, and he steered it through the Senate very skillfully, because there was opposition to it from the textile industry and pottery and other special interests in the various eastern and southeastern states, notably. And so he had to overcome their objections, and it required a great deal of statesmanship and skill, legislative skill, which he had in large measure, and I think that the hard fight that he put up there in the Senate and the long hours he put in may have contributed to his early death, which we all regretted very much indeed. He was deeply interested in the foreign trade program, and had a feeling that if we could get the tariff schedules down across the board, that that is the United States export business would increase, and thus we would help to correct the balance of payments problem, which was a serious one. I think that he was right, and I think that ultimately, as a result of lower tariff schedules, the trade of the United States, the foreign trade of the United States will increase, and I think the foreign trade relations between nations will increase. So Senator Kerr was a far-sighted legislator, a hard fighter, very dynamic, and a great credit to the state.
Mr. Gossett, we've done a great deal of talking about personalities and people that you have known through your long, illustrious, and very colorful career, but we haven't done enough talking about you yourself. Could you tell us what are your plans for the future? Are you now in private practice, and what do you intend to do, or what are you currently engaged in?
I'm in private practice in Detroit. I was invited to come back to my firm in New York, but I preferred to live in Detroit. I'm there now in one of the large firms, engaged for the most part in corporation practice. My plans are to continue that work, to engage in corporation practice, and also to continue to do some work of public interest. I'm still interested in the education of Negroes as chairman of the United Negro College Fund, that raises a fund that raises money and finances the 36 privately financed Negro colleges. It seems to me one of the problems, and one of the great problems of our age, is to get our population, and especially the Negro part of our population, educated, so that they can take their place in the economic and social and philosophical life of the political life of the country. I think it's a very important work. Also, I'm a trustee of Columbia, and I can expect to spend considerable time in that area, and the other activities, members of boards of directors of various corporations and funds, continue to do, and at the moment I am chairman of a commission created by the American Bar Association called the ABA Commission on Campus Government and Student Dissent. We have on that commission 4 college presidents, 2 college deans, some judges, and others who are sophisticated in the matter of the campus conflicts that with which we are involved these days. And we hope to come forward by the middle of next month with a report establishing certain guidelines and standards to aid college administrators in dealing with the campus disruptions in which we're involved all over the country. We hope that, of course, we realize that no set of standards would fit every college campus. Every college campus is different. Problems are diverse and complicated, and they must be dealt with on an individual basis in the last analysis. Nevertheless, if the college administrators know what others think about how those problems can be dealt with, generally speaking, what legislation is available, what court procedures are available, what standards ought to be insisted upon, when to move and when not to move, and how to move, they would be aided greatly. So our report, we hope, will provide guidelines and suggested standards for the government of the campus, going clear back to the foundations of the government, and the right of the students to dissent and the extent to which they can dissent and demonstrate. We think that we can be helpful in dealing with the militants in a way that will not enable them to get the support, that will avoid their getting the support of the moderates. If those matters, if the issues, some of them false issues, but some of them feigned issues, raised by the militants are not dealt with skillfully and with good judgment, you run the risk that the moderate students will be alienated and they will assist the militants. Whereas if the militants are dealt with skillfully, they can be isolated and they can be exposed as people who are not constructive, who are trying to disrupt and have no constructive program in mind. And if they are exposed in that light, I think it's that we'll be able to prevent the spread of this violence and campus disruption that has been so disheartening and discouraging during the past few months. When I came to Oklahoma, and during the first years of our life here, the principal product of the state was agriculture, of course, notably cotton and the feed grains. When the oil was discovered a few years later, of course, that brought into the state people from many other states, had diverse experience and character and capacity. They raised the level of intelligence here. With them came merchants and service people, and the state grew very fast, and it has now become a first-class, developed industrial state, highly regarded. Its principal asset, of course, is its people. People here are resourceful, intelligent, and dynamic, and they're known all over the country for their industry and for their progressiveness. I think that this state is much more progressive than some of the states around it because of its the influx of people from other states, and because of the oil and other developments here. I think this state has assets that many of the states around it do not have, and I think it has a reputation throughout the country that is almost unique, sui generis, as we say in the law. And I'm proud of my background here, and proud of this state, and I expect it to go forward even faster, and I think it will surpass in development many of the states that border on its on north around it, that surround it, including the great state of Texas, where I was born. I think Oklahoma is a highly industrialized and sophisticated state among the states of this country.
Thank you, Mr. William T. Gossett.